Daniel Craig is not only one of the most successful James Bonds in history, but also a symbol of the revival of a film franchise that once stood on the brink of obsolescence. When he first appeared in Casino Royale in 2006, the film not only grossed over $600 million worldwide, but also received widespread critical acclaim, bringing Bond back as a gritty, realistic character with profound psychological depth. Building on that success, Skyfall in 2012 became the first Bond film to surpass $1 billion at the box office, while also winning 2 Oscars for Best Original Score and Best Original Song, solidifying Craig's position as the highest-grossing Bond of all time. Across his 5 films, his Bond era brought in more than $3.5 billion, making him one of Hollywood's biggest box office draws. Beyond Bond, Craig left his mark with diverse roles in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Knives Out, which earned him a Golden Globe nomination, and numerous prestigious Broadway stage projects where he was highly praised for his introspective acting. He has also been honored with several international awards, including the BAFTA Britannia Award for Outstanding Contribution to British Film, affirming his status not just as an action star, but as one of the rare, truly accomplished actors of his generation. But behind those glittering numbers and spotlight moments lies an entirely different story, one where every success was built on pains that not everyone could see. To deliver a realistic Bond, Craig performed many dangerous stunts himself, leading to a series of serious injuries, from torn muscles and a knee injury requiring surgery to chronic pain that lasted for years. There were times he admitted his body could no longer handle the demands of the role. Yet he kept going, not for fame, but out of responsibility to the character and the audience. That spirit made him not just play Bond, but live it, even if it meant trading his health and peace of mind. And in the rare moments when he revealed his exhaustion, people realized that behind the icon was not invincibility, but the enduring willpower of a man who wanted to quit many times, yet still chose to keep moving forward. If this story makes you think, please subscribe to the channel and hit like to join us in exploring the painful yet admirable journey of Daniel Craig. After all the glamour and the scars the world can see, Daniel Craig's real story begins somewhere very different to childhood, that was neither loud nor dramatic, but quietly left gaps that could never be filled. He was born on March 2nd, 1968, in Chester, England, into a family that wasn't particularly poor, but also far from whole. When he was very young, his parents divorced, and from that moment, Craig's life slipped into a state of instability he couldn't even name. He lived with his mother, an art teacher, a strong woman always busy with work and her own responsibilities, along with his sister. While his father's presence faded into something distant, never completely gone, but never close enough to be a real anchor. And that vague distance created in Craig a hard-to-describe sense of lack, not intense pain, but a quiet, persistent emptiness that made him always feel like he was standing outside something he was supposed to belong to. His childhood had food and clothes, but it lacked something more important, a sense of stability and security. While other kids could believe family was a place to return to, Craig grew up feeling everything could change at any moment, so he learned not to cling too tightly to anything, even people. It was in that absence that Craig gradually became reserved. He wasn't a loud or standout child. He was an observer, someone standing on the edge, quietly watching the world turn without fully joining in. This sensitivity didn't make him weak. Instead, it made him tough in a very particular way tough, by not showing emotions, by not letting anyone see the vulnerable parts inside. But at the same time, it also made him hard to open up to others, hard to trust, and even harder to feel truly connected. Meanwhile, his relationship with his mother became his only real anchor. She was the one who encouraged him to engage with art, taking him to the theater and showing him there were other worlds beyond the reality he lived in. And it was there that Craig first found a place where he could exist without having to explain himself. The stage didn't ask where he came from or care about his family. It only required him to be present. And for a child who always felt he didn't belong, that became a form of liberation. But even when art opened a door, it couldn't erase what had already formed. Craig entered his teenage years with a complex inner world, a part craving to be seen and recognized, and another part terrified of being understood too deeply. He started acting activities very early, not to become famous, but because it was the only way he could feel he had a place, a role, a reason to exist. Yet even in those moments he kept a certain distance from the world around him, as if always preparing for the possibility that everything could vanish at any time. And that very contradiction between the desire to connect and the fear of being hurt quietly shaped the Daniel Craig we see later, a man strong on screen but guarded and cautious in real life. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing isn't that Craig had an overly harsh childhood, but that he never truly had a place where he felt completely at home. There was never a clear moment to point to and say everything went wrong, but also never a moment to say everything was okay. And that very vagueness, that shapeless absence, followed him throughout his life, seeping into every role, every decision, every relationship, making him someone who always moved forward but rarely stopped to feel he had arrived. And when the world later saw him as an icon of strength and control, few knew that it was all built from a child who once didn't know for sure where he belonged. And perhaps that's why he spent his entire life searching for the feeling he never had, a place to truly stay. And then, as that sense of not belonging grew clearer, Daniel Craig made a choice many saw as reckless, leaving home at a very young age to pursue acting, as if he believed that if he couldn't find a place in life, he would create one on stage. He joined the National Youth Theatre, where for the first time he stood among others with similar longings, but even there he wasn't the most outstanding or the most noticed. He was just one of many young people trying to prove they deserved to exist. That pattern continued when he studied at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, a prestigious, grueling environment where talent was necessary but never enough. Craig worked obsessively hard, practicing, learning, observing, trying to perfect even the smallest details of his craft. Yet the world seemed to look past him, not because he wasn't good enough, but because he wasn't the type to easily draw attention. He wasn't loud, didn't seek the center, and in an industry where the spotlight always goes to those who know how to grab it, Craig stood on the edge, quiet, patient, but increasingly weary. After leaving school, reality proved far harsher than he had imagined. His first roles weren't big breaks, but tiny, scattered pieces, supporting parts, extras, brief TV appearances almost no one remembered. He went from audition to audition, carrying hope each time he walked into a room that this might be different, only to walk out with the same result: rejected, overlooked, or worse, replaced at the last minute. They were projects where he was cast, prepared, believed this could be the turning point, only for everything to suddenly disappear. The role going to someone else, the opportunity vanishing as if it never existed. And in those moments, the most painful thing wasn't the failure itself, but the feeling of not being important enough to be remembered. Craig wasn't the only one to go through that, but the way he endured it was distinctly his own. He didn't complain, didn't whine, didn't seek pity. He just kept going, day after day, year after year, like someone trying to keep an inner flame from going out even when no one else could see it. He took whatever work kept him going: small roles in British TV shows, low-budget indie projects, parts where his name appeared at the bottom of the cast list, if at all. And gradually a familiar feeling returned, the one he'd known since childhood, that he was here, existing but not truly seen, not truly recognized. There were nights, after coming home from a failed audition, when Craig had to face the question he couldn't avoid: whether any of this was worth it, whether the path he'd chosen would lead anywhere, or just an endless loop of hope and disappointment. But the next morning, he still got up and continued. Not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he didn't know what else to do but keep going, and that near-silent persistence became the foundation for the man he later became. Someone not easily broken, but also not easily seen. The heartbreaking part is that throughout all those years, Craig wasn't just fighting the industry, but also battling his own sense of self-worth. Every rejection wasn't merely a door closing, but a reminder that he still wasn't enough, still hadn't reached the level where the world had to pay attention. And when that happened over and over again, it began to seep deep into how he saw himself, making him more guarded, more reserved, less expectant, as if he were protecting himself from the next disappointment. But perhaps it was precisely in those unseen years that Daniel Craig became the man the world would later come to know not. A star born under the lights, but a person forged in the shadows. Someone who deeply understood the feeling of being overlooked and forgotten. And so when the opportunity finally arrived, he didn't just seize it. He brought with him everything he had endured to turn it into something deeper, truer, and more painful than any glamorous image Hollywood had ever manufactured, because deep down he was still the man who had once stood in a room full of people and felt like no one truly saw him. And then the following years of Daniel Craig passed in a quiet state that was almost invisible, as he continued to take on a series of small projects. British television shows, independent films, supporting roles in movies that weren't big enough to make waves, but also not bad enough to be completely forgotten, a gray area where one exists without truly being remembered. Craig worked relentlessly. He appeared in Our Friends in the North, Elizabeth, Love is the Devil, investing seriously in every role, each one carrying the effort of a man trying to prove he deserved a bigger chance. Yet the paradox was that although industry insiders highly regarded his acting ability, he still couldn't break through, as if there was always a bigger door ahead, but every time he got close, it slammed shut right in front of him, creating a very particular kind of exhaustion, not total failure, but success that wasn't enough to change anything. Craig began to get used to being called a good actor, but not a star. A compliment that sounded positive but carried an invisible limit, as if he had reached a certain point and could never go beyond it. And in the film industry, where everything is measured by explosions and life-changing moments, not having that breakthrough meant being stuck behind. He watched others, people with less experience, less depth, suddenly burst onto the scene, land major roles, become Hollywood's new faces, while he remained there, still working, still trying, but nothing really changed. Those years weren't loud, with no scandals, no great tragedies to recount. But it was the repetition of identical days that made them so heavy. Craig lived between hope and disappointment, each new project carrying a bit of expectation that maybe this time would be different, only to end in the familiar way. A good role, a few compliments. Then everything faded, no turning point, no transformation. And gradually, he began to feel like he was building a life without truly moving forward, as if he were running very fast but staying in the same place. There were moments when doubt crept into his thoughts. Whether this was the right path, whether all those years of effort would lead anywhere, or whether he would forever be an almost actor, almost successful, almost recognized, almost touching something bigger but never quite achieving it. And the scariest thing wasn't outright failure, but the vagueness of not knowing if he was heading in the right direction. Craig wasn't someone who easily gave up, but he also wasn't immune to feeling tired. And in those years, the exhaustion didn't come from the work itself, but from the sense that all his efforts seemed insufficient to change his fate. He kept taking roles, kept acting, kept living as a professional actor. But inside, something began to slow down, not because he lost passion, but because he was no longer sure where that passion would lead him, and that created a new emptiness, not from childhood, but from the present, a place where he was no longer a beginner, but not yet a success, a limbo that many people never escape. From the outside, Craig's life might have looked stable. He had work, roles, a certain position in the industry, but to him the feeling of standing still grew more and more pronounced, as if time kept passing but his life did not. And that was a very hard-to-detect kind of pain because it had no specific shape, no single event to point to. Yet it was present in every day, every choice, every thought, making him wonder whether he was moving forward or simply existing. And perhaps it was in those seemingly unremarkable years that something important happened quietly. Craig learned to endure uncertainty, learned to keep going even without any guarantee that things would get better, learned to live with not being seen or recognized, and those painful, drawn-out lessons became the foundation for the moment he didn't yet know was approaching. Because sometimes what changes a life doesn't come from one big leap, but from someone walking long enough in the dark that when the light appears, they not only see it, but know how to stand firm in it. And then, when Daniel Craig began to realize he had gone too far to turn back but not far enough to be called a success, something else gradually emerged. He started to get noticed, but not in the explosive way his youthful dreams had promised. It wasn't a sudden worldwide turnaround, but scattered glances, comments that he had something, that he was worth watching, roles that began to have more depth, directors starting to remember his name, yet it all stayed at the level of almost enough, a state just sufficient to feed hope, but also enough to prolong the waiting, and in a way that was even more exhausting than complete obscurity. By then, Craig was no longer the young man just entering the profession. He had passed the age Hollywood usually calls the golden window to become a star. Each passing year no longer just time but pressure, a reminder that opportunities don't last forever. He watched younger, faster, more attention-grabbing people move ahead. And though he didn't feel envy, he couldn't help but feel a quiet anxiety, whether he was slowing down or, worse, whether he had already missed the one moment that could change everything. And that question began to follow him through long days, auditions, solitary moments when there was nothing left to hide his real thoughts. Bigger opportunities started to appear, but always with a tiny gap he couldn't cross. There were roles he came very close to, auditions where he knew he had done well, times when he felt this might finally be different, but the outcome remained the same. Not that he was bad, just not quite right, not quite stand out, not quite whatever they were looking for. And the repetition of those two words, not enough, gradually became an echo in his head, not loud, but persistent, making him start doubting not just the opportunities, but himself. The pressure of age didn't come suddenly. It crept in slowly, infiltrating every decision, every choice. Craig began to realize he no longer had much time to wait for a miracle. He could no longer comfort himself with, "I'm still young. There's still time," because the truth was that time was slipping away, bit by bit, and if he didn't seize it, there might be no more chances. That awareness made every step heavier, not because he lacked ability, but because he understood the cost of failing at this point. It wasn't just a lost role, but possibly the last door closing. There were moments when the greatest fear took shape, not fear of total failure, but fear of becoming just enough. A mid-tier actor with a stable career but no breakthrough. A name people respected but didn't remember. A safe path that never reached what he had once dreamed of. And for Craig, that was perhaps even scarier than never having tried. Because he had tried, had struggled, had sacrificed, yet the result remained stuck in the middle. His belief didn't disappear, but it was no longer as solid as before. It became more fragile, easier to shake, especially on days when nothing seemed to progress. Yet what made Craig different wasn't that he never doubted, but that he kept going despite the doubt. He still auditioned, still took projects he believed had meaning, still worked with an almost stubborn seriousness, as if he were fighting the fear inside himself. as if he believed that if he stopped, everything would truly end. And it was in that fragile state when belief was no longer complete, when time became pressure, when opportunities were close enough to touch but still far enough to slip away, that Daniel Craig continued moving forward. Not with the certainty of someone who knows they will succeed, but with the persistence of someone who refuses to stop. And perhaps what he didn't realize then was that those very doubtful steps, that continuation amid uncertainty, were what brought him closest to the moment that would change everything, a moment he had waited so long for that he had almost come to believe it would never arrive. And then, the moment Daniel Craig had waited for through so many years finally arrived, but not in the way he had ever imagined. When he was chosen to become James Bond, it should have been the pinnacle, the dream that any British actor would crave, an iconic role that could change an entire life with one decision. But instead of being welcomed, Craig stepped into Bond amid a storm he was completely unprepared for. Almost immediately, a wave of backlash exploded across the media and the public. Forums were flooded with anger. Newspaper headlines spared no harsh criticism. People didn't just doubt him. They rejected him outright, declaring he wasn't Bond, that he didn't have the right look, wasn't suave enough, wasn't charming enough. Even his blonde hair became an excuse for mockery, something unprecedented in the character's history. Boycott campaigns emerged, with some calling for people not to watch the film just because of Craig. And in the moment when he should have felt he had finally arrived, he instead faced a familiar feeling, but on a far larger scale. The feeling of rejection, no longer confined to a small room or a private audition, but in front of the entire world. Craig was no stranger to being overlooked, but he had never faced rejection on this level. It wasn't just professional commentary, but personal attacks, ridicule about his appearance, his style, even his character, as if he had made a mistake by accepting the role, as if he were trying to claim something that didn't belong to him. And that created enormous pressure, not just professionally, but mentally. Because every day leading up to Casino Royale's release, Craig had to live in an atmosphere where every glance carried doubt, every expectation was tinged with negativity, and there was no guarantee he could change any of it. That pressure didn't just come from the outside. It began to seep inside as well. Craig understood that this was no longer just a role. It was a test where failure wouldn't just affect Bond, but could collapse his entire career. He had no safe choice, no way back, and that made every day of preparation a real battle. He trained brutally, transformed his body, learned to bring a different Bond, tougher, rougher, more real, but even as he did all that, he could never be sure it would be enough, because the issue wasn't just his performance, but whether the world was ready to accept a Bond, unlike the one they were used to. There were moments when the isolation felt clearer than ever. Craig wasn't someone who sought attention, but he couldn't escape it either. Every interview, every public appearance became another test, another chance to be judged, compared, pressured to prove he deserved it. And amid all that, perhaps the most painful thing was the feeling that no one was truly on his side, not because they personally hated him, but because they had a Bond image in their heads, and he didn't match it. For Craig, this wasn't just a professional challenge, but a painful repetition of what he had gone through before, the feeling of existing, but not being accepted, the feeling of standing at a door he had fought to reach, only to be told he didn't belong there. The only difference was that this time the door wasn't a small audition, but one of the biggest roles in the world, and the rejection didn't come from a few people, but from millions. But Craig didn't walk away. He didn't quit. Not because he didn't feel the pressure, but because he understood that if he backed out, everything would end the way others had already decided for him. And so he chose to stay, chose to step into the role with everything he had, even with no guarantee it would be enough to change the world's mind. And in the months waiting for Casino Royale to premiere, Daniel Craig wasn't a star enjoying the biggest turning point of his life. He was a man standing between two possibilities: Either he would prove all the criticism wrong, or he would become living proof of his greatest fear, that no matter how far he had come, he could still be rejected. And perhaps what made this phase so tragic wasn't the opposition itself, but the silence behind it. No one knew what he thought in those nights before the premiere. No one knew how much doubt and fear he carried into every scene, every shot, because Craig wasn't someone who shared easily. He carried it all alone, as he always had since he was a child. And that very silence, that unseen endurance, was what defined him more than any role ever could. In the moment when the whole world seemed to turn its back on him, Daniel Craig still stood there, not as someone certain of victory, but as someone with no other choice but to keep going. And sometimes those are the very moments when everything seems against you, that reveal who you truly are most clearly, not through words, but through whether you stay or not. And then, when Casino Royale finally premiered, what Daniel Craig had waited for in silence happened so fast it was almost impossible to grasp. The film didn't just succeed, it exploded. Audiences who had once doubted him began to change their tone. Critics praised his performance as one of the most authentic and powerful Bond versions ever. A Bond, no longer a distant icon, but a vulnerable human who could be hurt, who could feel pain, who could fail. And that allowed Craig not just to play Bond, but to completely redefine the character, turning it into something new, rougher, deeper, truer. And in that moment it seemed like everything had finally changed, as if all the years of being overlooked, rejected, and doubted had been repaid, as if he had proven to the whole world that they were wrong. But what few people realized was that this victory didn't bring the relief one might expect, because, for Craig, it wasn't like reaching a destination, but like stepping into a new game, with far harsher rules, where every success wasn't an end, but the start of even greater pressure. Once he was recognized, once the name Daniel Craig began to be linked with Bond in audiences' minds, expectations shifted. Not from "can he do it" to "can he do it even better?" And that shift from doubt to expectation brought a different burden, more subtle, harder to detect, but no less heavy. Craig no longer had to prove he deserved it, but he had to prove he could sustain it. That Casino Royale wasn't a lucky moment, but the new standard, meaning every subsequent film couldn't afford to fail, couldn't afford to be just good, but had to surpass what he had done before. And in a world where audiences always demand more, where today's success becomes tomorrow's minimum, Craig began to realize there was no stopping point, no moment where he could truly breathe and say, "I've made it." Because the instant he achieved that, a new goal appeared. The following films, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, continued to solidify his position, especially Skyfall when it crossed the $1 billion mark, making Craig the most commercially successful Bond, and from the outside it looked like the peak, something any actor would dream of. But inside, his feelings were far more complicated, because each success didn't erase the pressure but made it bigger, deeper, and more personal, as he no longer faced the world's skepticism but his own standards that he had created. There was a hard-to-accept truth that Craig gradually came to realize, that proving himself right wasn't the end of the pain, but sometimes just the beginning of a different kind of pain, one he couldn't easily share. Because from others' perspective he had it all: fame, money, recognition. And so there was no room to complain, no space to say, "I'm tired," because that would be misunderstood, seen as not appreciating what he had. And so Craig kept going. He worked harder, trained harder, pushed his body beyond limits, not just to meet audience expectations, but to meet his own. And that began to create a cost no one saw at first. Small pains became more frequent. Injuries took longer to heal, nights when he couldn't sleep because his body wouldn't allow it. But all of it was hidden beneath the perfect Bond facade, an image that wasn't permitted to have cracks. Perhaps what made this phase so tragic was the contradiction between what the world saw and what Craig felt. On the outside, he was proof that effort pays off, the story of a doubted man who proved his worth. But on the inside, he was still the person used to fighting just to exist, only now the fight wasn't to be seen, but to not collapse under what he had achieved. And when everything seemed to be at its height, when Daniel Craig had everything he had once craved, a quiet question began to emerge. Whether the price of becoming Bond was greater than he had imagined, and if so, how much longer he could keep paying it. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't climbing to the top, but staying there, when every passing day demands you be stronger, more resilient, and willing to sacrifice more, even when you're no longer sure it's worth it anymore. And just when everything seemed to have reached its peak, Daniel Craig began to realize a truth no one had told him when he took on the role. James Bond wasn't just a character, but an identity, and once you put it on, it's not easy to take off. The name Daniel Craig gradually faded from how the world saw him, replaced instead by Bond. Always Bond. In every headline, every interview, every public image, he was no longer asked about himself as a person, but about his role, no longer seen as an actor with many possibilities, but as the embodiment of an icon that had existed for over half a century, and that, while bringing glory, quietly took away something vital: the ability to simply be himself in others' eyes. Craig tried to break free, not by rejecting Bond, but by seeking other roles, smaller projects, different stories where he could show sides that Bond didn't allow. Yet each time he did, he faced a familiar reality. Audiences didn't see those roles the way they saw Bond. The films outside Bond never got the same level of attention, never carried the same expectations, and gradually a clearer feeling formed that no matter what he did, Bond would still be what defined him, and everything else would just be secondary. This imbalance didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, year by year, film by film, as Craig realized his choices were narrowing, not because he lacked opportunities, but because every opportunity was measured against Bond. Every decision weighed against the Bond image, and that made artistic freedom, the thing he had pursued since the beginning, gradually feel out of reach. He was no longer fully free to experiment, to fail, to explore, because every move happened under the gaze of an enormous expectation he couldn't escape. Fame, which he had once craved, now became an invisible system of control. His life no longer belonged entirely to him. Every appearance, every statement, every personal choice could become a headline, dissected, judged, and for someone as private as Craig, that didn't bring pride but suffocation. He began to avoid the media, keep distance from the public, not because he didn't value the audience, but because he needed space to exist without being defined by a single role. But even as he tried to create distance, Bond was still there, not just on screen but in how the world looked at him, and gradually a profound contradiction emerged. Bond was the reason he had everything, but also the reason he couldn't escape a single version of himself. And that began to change the shape of success, turning it from something desirable into something that could trap a person. There were moments when Craig clearly felt he was living in a trap he had walked into himself, not because he was forced, but because he had chosen it, and that made it harder to escape. How do you walk away from something that gave you everything? How do you leave when there's no guarantee you'll find anything equivalent? And that very tension between staying and leaving began to become an inseparable part of his life. What makes this story so painful isn't that Craig lost everything, but that he had so much to lose, and so every choice grew heavier. Every decision carried a price, and while the world saw a man at the height of his career, Craig began to feel like he was slowly losing the most important parts of himself: freedom, privacy, and the ability to exist beyond the shadow of a character he had played too well. And perhaps the most tragic thing is that he couldn't easily say it, because from others' perspective he was proof of success, of rising up, of seizing an opportunity and turning it into legend. But inside the story was different. Not one of complete triumph, but of a man learning to live with the price of that very success, day by day, little by little. When the role that gave him everything also began to take away things he never thought he'd have to trade. And then, as the price of fame started to become clear not just in his mind but on his body, Daniel Craig realized that the role of James Bond hadn't just taken his freedom, but was quietly wearing down the very body he had used to create that image. From the earliest films, he chose to perform many action scenes himself, rather than rely entirely on stunt doubles, not to prove anything but because he believed authenticity had to be paid for with real presence. And that choice opened a chain of injuries that lasted for years, from seemingly minor falls during Casino Royale filming to more complex action sequences in Quantum of Solace, where his body first started sending warning signals, pains that lingered longer than usual, wounds that no longer healed as quickly, but he kept going because once you're Bond, stopping isn't an easy option. By Skyfall, the pressure wasn't just about expectations, but physical as well. Craig faced increasingly grueling shoots, chases, fights, impacts that each time left marks, but perhaps the real turning point came with Spectre, when he suffered a serious knee injury during filming, an injury he couldn't just push through, but one that forced surgery. And in that moment, for the first time, his body was no longer something he could force to continue, but a real limit, a boundary he couldn't cross with willpower alone. And that changed how he saw not just the role, but himself. But even after the surgery, Craig returned, still completed the film, as if enduring had become part of who he was. And then, when No Time to Die began production, once again his body betrayed him. This time a severe ankle injury during a scene that forced a halt in filming, an interruption he might have tried to avoid at all costs before. But now he could no longer control everything as he once did, and that made the reality clearer than ever. His body was changing, and not in the way he wanted. The injuries were no longer isolated events, but began to accumulate into a lasting state, chronic pain. Aches that didn't disappear after the film wrapped, that didn't vanish when he left the set, but followed him into everyday life, into mornings when he woke up feeling his body heavier, into nights when sleep was interrupted by dull throbbing. And what made it so hard wasn't just the pain, but the realization that it wouldn't fully go away, that every film didn't just leave a mark on his career, but a trace on his body. Craig wasn't the only one in the industry to endure this, but the way he faced it had a very distinct tone. He didn't flaunt it, didn't turn it into a story for attention. He just kept going, as he always had. But that continuation now carried a different weight, not striving to achieve something anymore, but enduring to maintain what he had, and in a way that was far harder. There were days when his body no longer responded as before. Movements that were once easy now felt heavy. Action sequences that were once instinctive now required more careful preparation, and in those moments, an unavoidable question began to emerge. How much longer could he keep going, and was the price of continuing still worth paying? Because every time he stepped into a new Bond film, it wasn't just a project, but another time. He put his body on the line, another acceptance that there would be more wounds, more pain, more things he'd carry long after it ended. What makes this phase so tragic isn't that Craig weakened, but that he stayed strong, kept going even when his body began to say no, because there's a huge difference between choosing to endure when you can and continuing to endure when you know each time will leave lasting consequences. And Craig somehow still chose to continue, not because he didn't recognize the price, but because he understood some roles can't be completed without sacrifice. And looking back, each Bond film wasn't just a chapter in Daniel Craig's career, but a part of his body, etched in by injuries, surgeries, pains the audience never saw. And perhaps what made it all the heaviest was knowing those scars wouldn't disappear when the lights went out, that when the world remembered him as a strong, unbreakable Bond, He would be the only one who knew that behind that image was a body worn down bit by bit just to keep the legend alive. And then, when his body finally began to speak through pains he could no longer hide, Daniel Craig faced another truth fame. The thing people always believe can change everything didn't bring him the peace he once thought it would. On the contrary, when his name became one of the most recognized on the planet, when his image was tied to one of cinema's greatest icons, his personal life shrank to the point where there was almost no room left to breathe. Craig wasn't someone who liked to show off. He had never sought attention beyond the work, but the Bond role placed him in a position where being noticed became unavoidable. Every public appearance, every word, every action could become a headline, dissected, twisted, and gradually he began to withdraw. Not because he didn't value the audience, but because he needed a space where he wasn't Bond, wasn't an icon, but just a person. Craig avoided the media more, limited interviews, carefully selected his public appearances, not to create mystery, but to protect himself from the intrusion that fame brought. He lived privately, keeping his personal life as private as possible, as if that were the only way to hold on to a piece of his true self. But that very privacy came with a price: isolation. Because when you constantly keep distance from the world starts keeping distance from you too. And in an industry where relationships play a big role, Craig wasn't someone with a lot of close friends. He didn't show up at big parties, wasn't part of power circles, didn't build networks the way many others did, and that made him, despite his fame, someone standing outside the very industry he was such an important part of. There's a paradox in Craig's life. The more known he became, the less understood he felt. Millions could recognize him on the street, call his name, recount his roles, but very few truly knew who he was when the cameras weren't rolling. And for someone who grew up with the feeling of not belonging, that wasn't easy to accept. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a quiet one, that even at the center of attention, you could still feel yourself on the edge of everything. Hollywood, with all its lights and opportunities, never truly became home for Craig. He never fully blended into its culture, never fully felt he belonged to it, and that created a distance that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't completely erase. He worked in the industry, succeeded in it, but wasn't really part of it the way many others were, and that kept him always holding back a step, always cautious, as if standing in a world he understood but didn't fully trust. Success, in Craig's case, didn't bring the liberation many imagine. It didn't erase past feelings, didn't fill long-existing gaps, but only changed their shape from invisibility to isolation in the spotlight, from not being seen to being seen too much, but not understood, and that created a very hard-to-describe state of loneliness, not from having no one around, but from having no one truly reach the real you. There were moments when Craig chose silence over sharing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he wasn't sure what he said would be understood correctly. And gradually, that silence became part of how he existed, a layer of protection, but also a barrier, making the distance between him and the world grow wider. And while audiences kept seeing him as an icon of strength, control, a man who could never be broken, Craig lived with a different reality, where success didn't equal happiness, where fame didn't equal connection, and where the light, no matter how bright, couldn't illuminate all the dark corners inside a person. And perhaps what makes this phase the most heartbreaking is that Craig didn't lose everything. He still had his career, respect, things many dream of. But he also realized those things couldn't replace the feeling of belonging, couldn't bring the peace he'd been searching for so long. And while the world kept seeing him as someone who had it all, Craig began to understand that some things can't be measured by success, and some gaps, no matter how much you achieve, stay there quietly, never disappearing, just waiting for quiet moments to remind you they're still there. And then, After all those years of silent endurance, after accumulated injuries and the isolation fame brought, Daniel Craig finally reached a point where he couldn't continue as before, a point where everything inside began to crack. And Spectre was where that crack became clearest. The filming process wasn't just a physical challenge, but a prolonged mental battle, as Craig carried all the expectations built up over years. Every scene not just part of the movie, but part of a burden he couldn't put down. And when the film ended, what remained wasn't satisfaction, but a profound exhaustion, as if he'd used up everything he had and still wasn't sure it was enough. In a rare moment of honesty, Craig said he'd rather slit his wrists than play Bond. Again, a shocking statement that spread across headlines, sparked debate, was analyzed and interpreted in many ways. But what few realized was that behind those words wasn't arrogance or disrespect, but a tired cry, an expression of a man pushed to his limit and no longer knowing how to say it more gently. Craig wasn't someone who liked drawing attention with words. So when he said it, it wasn't a strategy, but a moment when his protective layer could no longer hold. The pressure by then wasn't just external anymore, but had become internal. Craig wasn't only facing audience expectations, but his own created image a strong, unbreakable bond. And that made admitting fatigue almost impossible. Because how could someone seen as the icon of strength say he was burned out? And that very contradiction trapped him between two states: the real person who needed to stop, and the image he couldn't easily let go of. There were moments when Craig began to feel he was drifting away from himself, as if he no longer fully controlled his life but was being swept along by a current he couldn't stop. Decisions were no longer based just on personal desire, but influenced by too many factors: contracts, expectations, industry pressure, and that created a deep sense of disconnection, not just from work, but from himself, as if he were playing a role not only on screen, but in life too. The breaking point didn't come to Craig in a loud way. There was no specific event people could point to and say, "This is when it all fell apart." It came slowly, accumulating through years, films, times he chose to continue even when body and mind said stop. And at a certain point, all of it converged. Not to destroy him instantly, but to make him realize he couldn't go on the old way anymore. What makes this phase so painful is that the public didn't really see it. They saw the shocking, quote, the headlines, but not what led to it. Not the nights Craig couldn't sleep from pain and overthinking. Not the moments he had to wonder if he still had the strength to keep going. Not the tug of war between leaving and staying, and that invisibility made his pain even more isolated. Because it wasn't understood, wasn't shared, just existed inside him like pressure with no clear way out. Craig was never someone who easily collapsed. And even then, he didn't give up, the way many imagine. But what changed was how he saw everything. For the first time, he wasn't sure continuing was right. For the first time, he had to face the possibility that maybe it was time to stop. And that realization that he had limits was one of the hardest things for someone used to pushing through everything with willpower. And perhaps the most tragic thing isn't that Craig reached the breaking point, but that he reached it alone. While the world still saw him as an unbreakable icon, no one truly saw that behind that image was a man trying to keep himself from falling, not with strength, but with persistence. And sometimes that very persistence continuing when you're no longer sure you can is what makes everything more painful than ever. And while the world kept viewing Daniel Craig through the lens of an icon, while the pressure and inner cracks hadn't yet healed, he gradually found the one place where he could temporarily let everything go, not on set, not under the lights, but in a quiet, steady relationship with Rachel Weisz, the woman who didn't come to change him, didn't come to heal him the way fairy tales often tell, but simply was there, close enough so he didn't feel alone, but respectful enough that he didn't have to become a different version of himself. Their relationship wasn't loud, wasn't showy. wasn't built on glamorous moments, but on a quiet understanding between two people who had been through enough to know peace doesn't come easily. Family, in that way, became the only refuge Craig could turn to when everything outside grew too heavy. Not a perfect place, not one that erased all he'd been through, but the only place he could temporarily set down the role, the fame, the expectations he couldn't escape when stepping out. In that private space, he wasn't Bond, wasn't a star, but just a husband, a father, and that very simplicity, something he'd never truly had before, brought him a feeling he'd been searching for so long. The feeling of belonging to something that didn't demand he prove himself, didn't require him to be perfect. Craig began to actively step away from the spotlight more, not because he was rejecting work, but because he understood that if he didn't set boundaries himself, no one else would do it for him. He limited his media appearances, was selective with projects, kept his personal life separate from public attention, not to create mystery, but to protect what was left of himself from being completely swept away. And in a world where everything can become a headline, holding on to a private corner became a form of strength, a way for him not to lose himself entirely. In those quiet moments, Craig started to reclaim the balance he had lost long ago, not by completely changing his life, but by adjusting how he existed within it. He no longer tried to prove anything to everyone, no longer put himself in situations he didn't truly want, and that brought a certain relief, a rare stillness amid years of intense pressure, as if he had finally found a rhythm he could keep up with instead of constantly chasing things beyond his endurance. But even in that peace, one truth remained. What he had gone through didn't disappear just because he found a place to rest. The inner wounds, the pressures accumulated over years, weren't things that could be erased simply by love or privacy. They were still there, quietly, sometimes dormant, sometimes rising unexpectedly in unannounced moments, reminding him that who he was wasn't shaped only by what he had now, but by everything he had endured to get here. And perhaps what makes this phase both gentle and sad is that Craig didn't find a simple, happily ever after. He wasn't fully healed, didn't escape what had hurt him, but he learned to live with it, learned to exist without letting it destroy him. And in a world that always seeks stories of absolute triumph, his story was different. Not one of overcoming everything, but of finding a way to keep going, even though what was behind him was still there. In the small circle he created for himself, family, privacy, moments without cameras, Daniel Craig could temporarily step out of the role that had defined him, but he also understood that was only part of the story, that when he stepped back out, Bond was still there, the pressure was still there, and decisions were still waiting. And that very awareness made the peace he found more precious, but also more fragile, as if he were standing between two worlds, one where he could be himself, and one he could never fully escape. And perhaps it was precisely in that intersection that his true self existed most clearly, not as an icon, but as a man trying to hold on to what remained of himself while still moving forward. And then, when Daniel Craig seemed to have found enough quiet to keep himself from collapsing, a decision he once thought he would never make reappeared, returning to Bond, not as an energetic reboot, but as a final confrontation with what had been tied to him for so many years. No Time to Die didn't come to him as an opportunity, but as something that needed to be completed. Not for fame, because he already had more than enough. Not for money, because he no longer needed to prove that, but for a deeper, harder-to-name reason. The desire to close the story in a way he could accept, not leave it hanging, not let Bond become something unfinished in his life. That decision wasn't easy, because Craig knew full well the price he had paid before. He knew his body wasn't what it used to be, knew that every action scene was no longer just a challenge, but a real risk, knew that his spirit had once reached its limit, and returning meant stepping back into all of that. But this time, Unlike before, he wasn't returning to prove anything to the world, but to confront himself, to confront the role that had given him everything but also taken so much. And that shift in motivation made this journey different. Craig entered No Time to Die, not as a Bond at his peak, but as a man carrying too many years on his shoulders. Every movement was no longer as effortless as before. Every scene demanded more from a body that had begun to tire. And right from the start, reality proved his fears were real. Injuries happened again. He had to stop again. His body reminded him once more that it couldn't be forced forever. But instead of withdrawing, Craig stayed, not because he didn't feel the pain, but because this time he had chosen it with full awareness. His mindset was no longer the same either. It wasn't the tension of having to prove anymore, but a more complex state, tired yet determined, wanting to end, yet not wanting to let go too quickly. Because even though Bond had become a burden, it was also an inseparable part of who he was. And saying goodbye wasn't just leaving a role, but closing a long chapter of his life. A chapter that had shaped him in ways nothing else could. There were moments on set when Craig wasn't just playing Bond, but reliving his entire journey from the days of doubt to the times of proving. The injuries, the pressures all seeming to converge in one final time, and that gave every scene a different weight, no longer just part of a fictional story, but part of a real one, where the line between character and person began to blur. Returning in a state of exhaustion wasn't something many could understand. From the outside, it might look like a choice, but for Craig, it felt like a personal obligation, something he needed to do to be able to move on, to not carry unfinished business. And that made this journey both powerful and painful, because he was no longer doing it for easy-to-understand reasons, but for deeper, more personal ones, and therefore harder to share. And as the filming days passed, as each scene was completed, Craig drew closer to the moment he knew was coming. The last time he would stand as Bond. The last time he would carry the image that had defined him for so many years. And in that moment, the emotion wasn't victory, wasn't relief, but a hard-to-name mixture, part ending, part loss, because even though he had wanted to leave, that didn't make leaving easy. Perhaps what makes this phase the most profound is that Craig didn't return when he still had much to prove, but when he had almost nothing left to give. And in that state, he delivered a different Bond, not just strong, but tired, not just resilient, but marked by time. And perhaps that's why this return wasn't just a film, but a farewell, not only to the audience, but to a part of himself he had carried for too long. And as the journey of No Time to Die moved toward its conclusion, Daniel Craig wasn't just finishing a movie. He was reaching the end of a journey where every step had been paid for with time, effort, and the deepest parts of himself. The filming process didn't become easier just because it was the last time. On the contrary, it grew heavier because every scene carried the meaning of an ending. Every day on set wasn't just part of the job, but a step closer to the moment he would have to let go of what had been tied to him for so many years. And throughout that process, his body kept speaking. The pains didn't vanish, old injuries didn't fully heal, and every time he stepped into an action scene, it was no longer just dedication, but a conscious trade-off, a decision to continue knowing the consequences. Craig no longer tried to push past his limits the way he once did, but learned to work with those limits. Yet that didn't make everything easier, because even as he listened to his body, the reality was he was still asking it to do things it was no longer as ready for. And that tension between will and ability created a state both resilient and fragile, where every small success, a completed scene, a day without incident, carried a price only he truly understood. But perhaps the hardest part wasn't the physical, but accepting that this was the last time, that after all those years of attachment he would have to leave Bond, not because he no longer could, but because he understood that if he continued, the price would become too great. And that realization that some things you must let go of not because you want to, but because you need to, was one of the hardest things a person can face. Craig didn't leave in failure, but he also didn't leave in a sense of triumph, because what he was doing wasn't conquering another peak, but closing a chapter he had gone to the very end of. The moment he truly said goodbye to Bond wasn't loud or dramatic in the way people might imagine. No big announcement, no single scene that could capture everything he had been through. But it came quietly, in the personal realization that it was over, that he had done all he could, that there was nothing left to add, and that very quietness made it more real, because true endings rarely come with applause, but often in moments only you understand the meaning of. For the world, No Time to Die was a success, a fitting conclusion to one of the most beloved Bonds. But for Craig it was a closure carrying far more emotions than joy, because every frame wasn't just part of the movie, but part of his life. And when the film ended, what remained wasn't just a cinematic legacy, but what he had to sacrifice to create it. Perhaps what makes this price so heavy is that it can't be seen clearly. There's no number to measure it, no award to compensate for it. Because that price lies in the years he gave to the role, in the injuries he will carry forever, in the parts of life he had to set aside, and all of that doesn't disappear when the cameras stop, doesn't end when the film premieres, but continues to exist as part of him. And when Daniel Craig stepped out of Bond for the last time, he didn't just leave a character, he left a version of himself, a version built over many years, through many challenges, through so much endurance, and letting it go wasn't a simple act, because it wasn't just leaving a role behind, but accepting that an important part of his life had ended and could never come back. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, not a moment when everything became perfect, but a closure complete, necessary, yet inevitably carrying sadness. Because sometimes the greatest things you do are also the ones that demand you give up the most. And in Daniel Craig's case, Bond wasn't just the role that took him to the top, but also the final price he had to pay to become the person the world will never forget. And when the lights gradually dimmed, when the applause faded, and the image of James Bond closed in the audience's minds, what remained wasn't a flawless legend, but a man who had gone through that journey with everything he had. Daniel Craig was never a perfect person. He wasn't the suave Bond of classic standards, wasn't an instantly lovable figure from the start. He carried roughness, cracks, the very real limits of a human being. And perhaps that's exactly why his story isn't one of absolute triumph, but of survival, of continuing even when everything inside you has started to tire, of carrying pressure without letting it destroy you completely. Craig never truly escaped what the role placed on his shoulders. The pressure, the expectations, the marks Bond left all still there even after he left the character. But what changed was how he lived with them. He no longer fought against them, no longer tried to prove anything, but learned to accept that some things will always be part of him. And that acceptance isn't surrender, but a different kind of strength, a quiet strength. One that doesn't need to be seen but is enough to keep a person standing after everything they've been through. The legacy Daniel Craig left isn't just in box office numbers or awards, but in how he changed the way the world sees James Bond. He brought to the character a depth that hadn't existed before. A Bond who knows pain, knows fear, knows failure. A Bond, not an invincible icon, but a human with very clear limits. And that made the image more relatable, more real, and perhaps more memorable. Because in a world full of perfect archetypes, Craig dared to bring an imperfect version. And that very imperfection became what made him stand out. But if there's one thing Craig's journey truly proves, it's not who he became, but how he endured to become that person. Because behind every scene, every success, every celebrated moment are things the audience never sees: the pains, the doubts, the times he had to keep going when he himself wasn't sure anymore. And those things though never captured on screen, are the most important part of the story, the part without which nothing else would exist. Perhaps in a world always seeking stories of dazzling victory, Daniel Craig's story offers a different perspective, that not every win is bright and shining, not every success brings complete happiness, and sometimes what's most worth cherishing isn't how much you achieved, but how much you endured to not give up. That some people don't become legends because they never fell, but because they kept getting back up even when no one was watching. And looking back at that entire journey from a boy who didn't feel he belonged anywhere, to an actor overlooked in his early years, to a man doubted by the whole world, then becoming an irreplaceable icon, Daniel Craig isn't the story of a person who overcame everything perfectly, but of a person who carried all of it, never hiding, never denying, but turning it into part of himself, and that, more than any role, defined him. Because in the end, what makes him memorable isn't how well he played Bond, but how much he paid to do it. Not the spotlight he achieved, but what he had to carry when that spotlight faded, and in the silence after everything, when there are no more cameras, no more audiences, only his real self left. Perhaps that's where the story truly exists. Not as a legend, but as a man who went to the very edge of his limits and still kept going. He didn't escape the role, he endured it. And in the end, that is what made him unforgettable. The story of Daniel Craig leaves a feeling both heavy and profound, because it's not the familiar triumph narrative the public usually sees, but a series of quiet sacrifices that only become fully understood when looking back at the whole. From the intense public backlash when he was first cast as James Bond, mocked as not up to standard, to having to prove himself in Casino Royale, Craig stepped into the role not with support, but with near suffocating pressure. And when success came, it didn't bring liberation but bound him tighter. Bond became an inseparable image, gradually stripping away his artistic freedom and forcing him to live under the enormous expectations of the entire world. More painfully, the repeated injuries, knee surgery, ankle injury, chronic pain showed the physical price he paid was no small thing, and the peak came when he was burned out after Spectre, even saying he wanted to leave it all behind. But what hurts the most is that he returned for No Time to Die when he had almost nothing left to give, not for fame or money, but simply to close that chapter of his life as completely as possible, even while continuing to endure both physically and mentally. For American audiences, a society that highly values success and victory, this story serves as a reminder that not every achievement is as glorious as it appears on the surface, and sometimes true strength isn't in winning, but in the ability to endure, to keep moving forward even when no one is clapping anymore. If this story makes you reflect, please subscribe to the channel and hit like to keep joining us on these journeys, full of resilience yet so deeply human, just like Daniel Craig's. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the quiet prices hidden behind the spotlight.